A reading from Exodus. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Oreb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" He said, "I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain." But Moses said to God, "If I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they that ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He said further, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you.' This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations." The word of the Lord.
Well, hey everybody, it's name tag season. It comes with every new school year or start of a new job setting or new member class. It's that time of year when you begin with a new team or meet your new associates. My name is blank. What's your name? When you meet somebody new and learn their name, that's the moment when the relationship sets off in a purposeful direction. When persons remain nameless, however, there's a void of accountability, of the potential for making history is not there, of growing in understanding of one another. If you've ever parented a teenager, you know the experience when your kid gets into the car and you ask them about another kid at school that you see, and when you ask them what their name is, which they most certainly know, they respond with an "I don't know" in an annoyed tone. That means one thing, translation: I'm not friends with them, don't ask. I have no relationship with him or her. When Peter was challenged about his association with Jesus, he said, "I don't know the man," in reference to Jesus. When we begin to know someone's name, the door opens for the relationship to go somewhere, which makes Moses' encounter with God in Exodus chapter 3 a tour de force in redemptive advancement. God's call to Moses, notice that God knows his name already, which immediately tells us something about God's involvement and interest in the human drama, but also includes God's disclosure of his own name to Moses. "I am who I am," the God who will be God to you, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, simply Yahweh. Today, we begin a 3-part message series on the events of the Exodus from the book of Exodus, the first half of the book of Exodus. At the center of this story is Moses. Next to Jesus, Moses is probably the most recognizable human figure in all of history. The biblical account of the Exodus has and continues to make an indelible mark in the human story, expressed and referenced in art, literature, music, politics, pop culture, film, and now social media memes. To both Jews and Christians, the Exodus event is central to our understanding of redemption and how God's people are to respond to his gracious deeds of love and deliverance. The Christian conception of salvation in Christ is only intelligible through the lens of Passover and Exodus. References to Moses and to the Exodus form the skeletal framework for the accomplishment of Christ in the new covenant. In fact, it's difficult to even understand the ministry of Jesus at all and the gospel of Christ as it's shared with us in the four gospel accounts, apart from some reference or knowledge of Moses and the Exodus. Moses leads Israel out of literal bondage and slavery in Egypt in the first Exodus, but Jesus leads a new covenant Exodus people out of the slavery of sin and death. The first Exodus prepares the way for the last Exodus, and the last Exodus brings the fullness of meaning out of the first. At the end of the book of Genesis, as it draws to a close, the sons of Jacob had found refuge from a season of famine through the incredible events of the life of Joseph, one of Jacob's sons. The family of Jacob, the Hebrews, settled in Egypt, where they prospered and multiplied and became large in number, so large that Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who did not know Joseph, became threatened by the enormity of the population of the Hebrew people, rapidly growing. So they were conscripted into slavery. In spite of this, God still prospered them. In his anger, Pharaoh multiplied their work and the miseries of their treatment. He also called for the midwives to kill all the male-born Hebrew babies that came into the world. But the God-fearing midwives were shrewd and they wouldn't do it. When challenged by Pharaoh, they told him that the Hebrew women were vigorous and they gave birth so quickly that they didn't have time to dispatch the newborn males. So Pharaoh issued a more general order to all of his people. Quote, "Every boy that is born, drown him in the Nile River, but let the girls live," close quote. Moses was born into this very context. His mother concealed his birth for about 3 months, and then rather than face the inevitable drowning at the hands of the Egyptian authorities, Moses' mother makes a basket covered with pitch and tar so that it floated, literally a miniature ark. She placed her infant son into the dangerous waters of the Nile, but into the awesome, secure hands of God, an act of faith in the hopeful providence of the God of her fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Perhaps you know how the story goes. The baby is discovered some short distance away by the daughter of Pharaoh himself, ironically. Pharaoh's daughter takes pity on the Hebrew baby. Miriam, Moses' big sister, looks on from afar and then approaches and offers to find a Hebrew woman who could nurse the baby until fully weaned. Of course, the woman is Moses' own mother. The Bible says, quote, "After the child was weaned, she presented him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted Moses as her son. She then named him Moses, which means pulled out of the water, saying, 'I pulled him out of the water.'" This was Moses' first Exodus event, as one scholar talks about it, a foreshadow of the events to come. But let's stop here for a moment to consider the ways that God has drawn us up, how God has preserved us in mercy and provided and prepared for us a refuge and carries us and holds us to himself. The storyline advances all the way to Moses' 40th year. He's a prince of Egypt on the outside, but on the inside, he's a descendant of Abraham and a recipient of God's covenant promise to Abraham. One day, Moses sees an Egyptian and a Hebrew fighting, and in a burst of justice-filled anger, Moses strikes down the Egyptian, killing him. The next day, Moses comes across two Hebrews fighting one another. When he asks them why they are quarreling, one of them asks why he thinks he should be judge over them and wants to know if Moses plans to kill one of them like the Egyptian that he killed the day before. Feeling a little exposed and scared, Moses flees Egypt and settles in the desert region of Midian, where he befriends Jethro the shepherd, marries one of Jethro's daughters, and works for the family business in relative obscurity. This was Moses' second Exodus, which of course looks like a defeat or failure, but actually becomes the staging ground, if you will, and a preparatory season for what God was planning all along for Moses. Only in God's providence and wisdom would our path go from slavery to the courts of the king, and from the courts of the king back to the humble obscurity of life tending Jethro's flocks in the middle of seemingly nowhere. But being a perceived nobody in the middle of nowhere are not categories that God seems to honor, much less even recognize. One day, Moses is watching his flock near Mount Oreb, the mountain of God, when he sees a burning bush, flames abounding, and yet the bush is not being consumed. Moses is curious. He turns to get a better look when the voice of God, described as the angel of the Lord, an expression in this case for God's very presence itself, speaks, calls out, "Moses, Moses." Moses replies, "Yes, I'm here." God says, "Don't come any closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for you're standing on holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face, afraid to look at God. Suddenly, the nobody in the middle of nowhere, up to nothing much, is taking off his shoes because the God of all creation is whispering his very own name and is causing the very ground where he is to be called holy. To recognize the moment at God's suggestion, time to take off the shoes. For us, it may be time to lift our voice in worship, may be time to fold our hands in prayer, may be time to give an offering of thanksgiving or to testify of his steadfast love. Removing your shoes is a gesture of simple obedience, a seemingly small act of response to the largesse of God's presence. These gestures are just the kinds of physical and intellectual and emotional responses that welcome us into a new Exodus-shaped pattern of living, a pattern of worship of God over against the futility of hopelessness or nihilism or atheism or foggy agnosticism or confusing pantheism. As theologian Terence Fredheim says about the meaning of the book of Exodus, it, quote, moves from slavery to worship, from Israel's bondage to Pharaoh to its bonding to Yahweh, close quote. Wherever Moses was in his view of life in the world, here he encounters the God who knows his name and who knows the plight of his enslaved covenant people, and who will call Moses to faithful servitude, and who will whisper to Moses his very own name. And mind you, Moses wasn't even looking for all this. It's the initiative, the gracious initiative of the God of steadfast love and faithfulness. It's in the background of Moses' life and in the layers of your life and mine, in the drama and pain of numerous Exodus-like experiences, that we are drawn up into the mystery of redemption and into the reality of the presence of a gracious Redeemer who ultimately reveals himself to us in the person of Jesus. Alistair Roberts says, God has fashioned Moses quietly and secretly into an Exodus-shaped person. He has given the life of Moses and the life of Israel the same pattern, as Paul will later point out when he says that Israel was, quote, baptized into Moses. God said, I've taken a good long look at the affliction of my people in Egypt. He says to Moses, I've heard their cries for deliverance from their slave masters. I know all about their pain, close quote. Perhaps we may sincerely question why the God of the Bible allows pain to exist to begin with, but we can't sincerely question the God of the Bible in terms of God's empathy with and participation in the unjust suffering of the whole world over. When God says, I know all about their pain, he speaks from experience past, present, and future. It's a pain that you and I are called to endure as well. Jesus would describe this to his disciples as cross-bearing, following in the way of Jesus, responding to his call to follow. For Moses, God was about to call him to a task so daunting it was laughable, so ironic it was incomprehensible. God told Moses, quote, it's time for you to go back. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the people of Israel, out of Egypt, close quote. To which Moses famously protests, of course, on account of incompetence, of course, and no less. Me, God? But I can't speak well. This is over my head. God says, I'll be with you. Are there any more stronger words of assurance that you or I could possibly hear, or Moses possibly hear and take in, than those very words, I will be with you? They're the same words Jesus gives to his disciples before he ascends into heaven. I am with you always to the end of the age. I am with you. Moses, though, is still in protest. He's the first in a long line of protesters, whiners, complainers, grumblers, doubters, pessimists, fraidy cats, little faiths, glass half empties, Eeyores, it'll never happens. We've all been lining up behind Moses, right? And then Moses comes up with one more reason for not going. Well, what about your name, God? Who am I supposed to say sent me? They're going to ask me, what do I tell them? God said to Moses, tell them, I am who I am. Tell the people of Israel, I am sent me to you. God continued with Moses, quote, this is what you're to say to the Israelites. God, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob sent me to you. You see, the self-disclosure of God's name to Moses, I am Yahweh, opens the door of redemptive love that could never be closed. God's covenant is an everlasting covenant for Moses and soon for Israel. To know God by name and to be known by him ignites a living faith through an authentic relationship with the Lord. In Moses' life, his encounter with the Lord at the burning bush and his call to be Israel's servant leader, we see in this how God is forming an Exodus-shaped child and an Exodus-shaped people. Just like Israel, the church is an Exodus-shaped people. You're an Exodus-shaped person. Only the Exodus of the new covenant is the final Exodus of a gospel reality. In Jesus' death and resurrection, he leads us through the waters of darkness and death to the land of promise. At the waters of baptism, we rehearse and renew this Exodus-shaped identity and destiny, remembering our call along with the God who both knows our name and shares his name with us, inviting us to worship him and welcoming us into a forever friendship that can never be taken away. Hello, my name is, thanks be to God.